Sacred attention therapy is an approach to liberation. The first liberation is from the conditioned self, psychology of early life. The second liberation is from the realization of the true nature, the fulfillment of oneself as a personality. And the third liberation is the liberation into the life of spirituality and spiritual practice. Sacred attention therapy, or SAT, is a meta-psychology because it embraces not only the physical, emotional, mental and energetic aspects of the human being, but also the spiritual and the transcendental. Therefore, it is uniquely placed to be an applied psychology through counselling and psychotherapy in the 21st century, in which human beings are more complex than ever before.
Welcome to the 9th in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey. My name is Rob Meager. Today's interview will discuss the lecture Devotion, Absolute Surrender to the Divine, from the Novena Teachings lecture series. This lecture is available in written form in Moksha Dawn, an ebook you can order from the books page of the Sacred Attention Therapy website. You can listen to the full recording of many of these lectures on the lectures page. And lastly, you can view many other interviews on the videos page. The URL for our website is www.sacredattentiontherapy.com. And on our website, you can click on the YouTube channel icon to view our YouTube channel. A little bit of background about Richard Harvey. Richard is a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He's the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century that proposes a 3-stage model of human awakening. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and the Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all over the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. It's now my pleasure to welcome Richard Harvey to the call.
Thank you, Robert.
Welcome, Richard.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
And with you.
This lecture, Devotion, Absolute Surrender to the Divine, you open the lecture up with the following sharing, and I quote, "Devotion is your absolute surrender to the spiritual divine, to God. Of course, there appears to be many kinds of devotion and surrender, or of things to surrender and devote yourself to. But in reality, there is only one, and it is devotion to the divine. In order to do this, you must stop doing everything that presently interests you and occupies your time. If you are not presently residing in reality, in perpetual reality, then you are in an illusion. And this means you are practicing devotion to the wrong object. The wrong object in this context is anything other than the absolute reality, everything other than the self-sourcing divine or totality of existence." End quote. And my question for you, Richard, is how does one reading or listening to the above passage know if it applies to them. So how does one know if they too need to stop everything they are doing?
I guess that passage would have a different impact depending on whether you were living a life of devotion or not. Apart from anything else, if you were living a life of devotion, you probably wouldn't be seeking a means, a way, or potentially listening to the talks. But putting that aside, if somebody who was already living the life of devotion heard that passage, I think that they would nod contentedly and in agreement and feel the truth in the words. And for those who aspire to the sacred spiritual existence, hopefully it's inspiring. I guess there's also a third possible response, which is from those who would see that as unattainable, at least at the present time, and who wouldn't even find that desirable. Because it does actually say something which is really quite hard, isn't it, to contemplate. If you're concerned about the world and doing and pleasure in the world and ambition and distractions and so on, then the idea of stopping doing all those things is clearly untenable.
So is it then safe to say that of those three groups, the group that Chomsky's having fun with you this morning, of the group that would find the passage undesirable, is it safe to say then that that is the group that it would most apply to?
Not necessarily, although you know that those who aspire towards a spiritual life, as opposed to those who don't, are not necessarily over time, they don't necessarily fulfill those expectations. It's very often, to give a parallel, in psychological work, in therapy, that people come full of vim and vigor to apparently go in for the long haul and do the archaeology on their psyche and so on, and maybe they work with you for a few weeks or months. Conversely, those who come in with a relatively minor psychological problem, you may be working with for many months or even years. There's really just no knowing. All you can conclude in the end is that whatever is apparent and therefore on the surface is not by any means necessarily the expectation that will be fulfilled, because essentially we're more unconscious than conscious, of course. So the aspiration towards spirituality doesn't prove anything, so to say. You could be resistant to it. So people listening to this and taking in that passage, you think, well, I can't imagine living a life without distractions in pleasure and activity and desire and fear and so on and so on, may, for all we know, be the very ones who in a month's time are, living in a Trappist monastery or something. It's quite possible.
You speak of devotion as a journey of awareness, and you describe the journey this way, quote, "Devotion is the flowering of awareness, and awareness is the preeminent practice of the seeker who is intent on attaining the awakening of the first stage of inner work, the process of self-discovery. In the first stage, you must practice devotion also, devotion to you. The object and the exclusive focus of your inner work practice is self, self, self. It is extremely selfish in the extreme. Yet selfishness taken to extremes is the way to selflessness. There is no other way, truly. Have the courage to be totally selfish, then selflessness will bloom in you spontaneously, unexpectedly. And I wanted to ask you, Richard, what is it about extremes that have such a foothold in the spiritual milieu? For example, as you talk about it, the journey of awareness is an extreme focus on oneself. But ascetic practices like sweat lodges or vision quests in the native Indian culture here in the West is another example of extremes. What is it about these extremes that bring about such dramatic changes?
There's an integrity in the inner realms. We know that you can think yourself into various states. We know that you can wish and manipulate yourself into certain postures and certain stances in the world, but in reality, to complete the first stage of awakening process, for example, it has to be absolutely real. And one of the things that may happen along the way and towards the end is people are liable to say, I think I might be in the second stage awakening, or I think I may be at the threshold and all of this. And all you can more or less say usually is no. And the reason no is because that self-consciousness that I am in those places, it self-invalidates. Mm-hmm. And what I was saying was it has to be, there's a natural integrity in the inner realm. So, for example, you cannot be somewhere you're not, even though you can hope and wish that you were. And I was using the analogy of psychological work in which people may say to me, I believe I'm at the end of the first stage, or I'm at the threshold of a transformation, or these kinds of things. And then I say, no. And they say, well, how do you know? And I say, because you wouldn't be conscious of it if you were. It's an interpretation, is what I'm knowing or thinking or feeling about it. And it's the same with, in the spiritual realms, we want to be spiritual, we want to be pure or kind or blissful and all of this. And of course, these things happen as a kind of byproduct. You can't pursue them, you can't attain them, you can't go straight at them. So what you have to do, and here the extremes now come in, is you have to carry on the clearing or the cleaning or the purifying process, which is humbling. Of saying, well, I guess there's a dark corner here somewhere, there's some sludge and tar and what have you, right at the bottom of the barrel there, and there's some smudge I still haven't got out, and you just carry on. And maybe you find it's a whole gallon of stuff, maybe it's a mountain of stuff, you don't know, and you just let it go. And of course what happens is you just wind up doing it for its own sake. And around this time, when you've let go of the grasping, of the wanting, of the needing, of the self who's trying to attain something beyond the present self, that's when, of course, you fall through the cracks. And it happens. So hence the extremes, or the idea of extremes in spiritual life. It's extreme in the sense that you keep going however long it takes.
Now, along the way, the spiritual teacher has a big role to play in that. And you go on to talk about and provide a glimpse of what devotion to a spiritual teacher or teaching is like. And you share it by quoting the following. Your devotion to the teacher, that teaching, and the way you choose is an extraordinary event. Extraordinary, even disorienting, because when the relationship to the teacher is completely authentic, the feeling is prior to your identity with your body-mind self-patterning. In other words, you encounter a depth of unworldly familiarity that challenges the reality of your ego processes and the life you have built around your separate identity. I wanted to bring this into our discussion here, discussing this lecture, because you share in your lecture on relationships from the same lecture series that one cannot explain their attraction to their teacher, not in words anyways, as it's beyond description. But you know the teacher is the one when you come across it. And my question is does devotion to a teacher continue on even after the teacher has left the worldly plane? And if so, what does that devotion look like?
It does, of course, but continue. But you see, the teacher is not a person or a personality in the worldly plane. So even though the teacher may appear in a certain form or other, he, she, it is not within that function of spiritual teaching a personality or a person. So he, she, it is already not in the earthly plane. The spiritual event is outside of space and time. The reality that I speak of, that we normally think of as God, for example, have traditionally used the word God to speak of, is the eternal, which is the place where you and I and everyone's listening to this, to me speaking just now, truly reside immediately and perpetually and constantly. So you couldn't have a teacher who was in this, who was, so to speak, on the surface of the ocean, who then stayed on the surface of the ocean because that's where he, she, or it lives, and would conduct you into the depths of the oceans of the world to explore or to lead you down through or to deepen. The spiritual teacher is a whole, or a connection between the temporal and the eternal. He, she, or it is not a person, is not a personality, and this is something that you come across, or I do anyway, constantly in social circles, in satsang circles, in spiritual circles, the, in a word, cultism that surrounds the spiritual grouping, who are involved with the spiritual teacher in an incorrect way, by which I mean they're involved with the spiritual teacher as a personality. They're entranced or fascinated by his or its preferences or looks or demeanor or speech or proclivities,
Mm-hmm.
in and of themselves, as an event that is somehow attractive to them. And a cult will form around that because they like the teachings, they resonate with the teaching, they're empathetic or sympathetic or aligned in some way to the teachings, which conforms to their ego preference, and they're attracted to this woman or this man or what have you. Has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the true spiritual teacher, who is necessarily not a personality. And I love, and I've mentioned at one of these talks, I think, Mariana Kaplan's book, which is called something like "Do We Need a Guru?" I think. And what's lovely about that book is she winds up, having been in the East with various relationships to Oriental masters, she winds up in San Francisco, as I recall, and perhaps still is, with her guru, who turns out to be a Jewish fellow. I forget his name. I mean, he is known, but he's a Jewish fellow with dreadlocks who plays harmonica in a rock band. Now, this is not her idea, or probably yours or my idea, of the spiritual teacher. And yet, having been exposed to these Orientals who seem to be the real deal, here she is with this fellow thinking, what on earth? Because the heart is irrational, and the heart will pull you toward, not by any means necessarily, an appearance of personality that embodies the eternal, that the heart then directs its longing toward.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a kind of long rigmarole, but it's a way of explaining the appearance and what's behind that. So the true spiritual teacher is, handsome, ugly, sounds good, doesn't sound good, smells, doesn't smell. I mean, all of these things, are possible. But inevitably, so long as we're talking about a spiritual teacher per se, he is, she is, it is a gateway into the eternal. And then, just to round that off, of course, it depends on the response of those who come, because there's going to be many who are egoically attached, not to him or her necessarily, but to themselves, and therefore the only relationship of which they're capable is a cultic relationship.
Now, even the devotee, you point out in the lecture, struggles with their personality and character. And you describe it this way, quote, "The devotee struggles a lot with personality and character since the complete transcendence of both are so crucial to the practice of devotion. A devotee comes to God through devotional practices and ordeal," end quote. Suffering seems to be at the core of many spiritual practices and teachings. For example, Buddhism. But it's also implied in that passage that I just read, where the devotee comes to God through devotional practices and ordeal. What does suffering and where does suffering fit in with your 3 stages model of human awakening?
In the first stage, the suffering is the delusion that I am the childhood ego. The childhood ego is shed at the end of that stage. The suffering of the second stage is the delusion that I am a separate self at all. So even realizing through practice and the ordeals and the tests of the second stage of awakening that, for example, compassion is not a subjective given material or something that's a relationship between you and I. It is. I am love. Love, therefore, in the natural state of relationship, in the real sense, simply exists. I get out the way. I allow myself to be an instrument. But even that, even being the hollow bamboo or the instrument of love, pertains to an ego state. And the ego state is synonymous with suffering. Suffering comes from the delusion that I am something other than. So the suffering is now of a finer vibration, you might say, but nonetheless the delusion of the tacit belief in the separate self, which divides me from existence, even though much less than when I was in survival mode in the childhood ego state. Nonetheless, this ego state of separation must be shed. So that's the suffering that's laid down, shall we say, toward the end of the second stage of awakening. And in the third stage of awakening, the suffering that persists is of a finer etheric nature, but it nonetheless consists of the idea that I as a separate self treading a spiritual path or practicing sadhana or lifetime spiritual discipline in order to be liberated. Even that idea or something similar has got to be relinquished too. What, of course, binds all of these together is the simple delusion of the separate self. There isn't one, so it will not lead to happiness. Therefore, it will only lead to sadness, despair, anger, violence, hate, etc., etc.
To finish off our interview for today, you address in the lecture the reality that not everyone in this lifetime may be a devotee. And this is what you share. But you may not be a devotee. Remember that you may want to be one, but it may not be possible. You can only grow into the flower that you truly are. Therefore, we can all work together for the good, as the Apostle Paul said. Here's the question. If a person recognizing the choices they have made in their life chooses to give up all expectation of attachment to what society says they should be doing, and rests in surrender to knowing what they are doing is exactly what they are supposed to be doing, and give over to that presence, is this a form of devotion?
Just run me through all those stages again.
So, if a person recognizing the choices they have made in their life, they accept the choices they've made in their life, and they're choosing to give up all expectation of attachment to what society says they should be doing, and they rest in the surrender to knowing they are exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, and give over to that, is that a form of devotion to God?
Yeah, I think it must have to be. I think the difficulty I had was right at the beginning, because the assumption is that we have choice, and the assumption is that that person has made choices that brings them to that place. And the reality is that, firstly, in my model, I think it's made clear that in first stage awakening, you don't have any choice. We've extrapolated that through these lectures, but also in the SAT online training to a great degree. Once all those prison bars are in and you say, well, what do you want to do now? I mean, there's really not a lot of choice. I'm going to do what my emotional behavioral patterns and so on dictate, even though I have this delusion of choice. So the first assumption or the first stage of what you said, it really depends on that person being at least in the second stage of awakening, and perhaps really and truly in the third, even if choice is an issue or a reality. Mm-hmm. Because once you're released from the early childhood conditioning ego structure, the other parts of the ego structure also give you absolutely no choice. The only freedom you have is the way in which you respond to what it is that happens in your life, not that you can get out of any of it. Mm-hmm. And that's a very important thing to bear in mind, because very often what we're doing is we're chafing and we're struggling with something that just isn't going to yield. And the thing that we could really be working fruitfully with, we completely ignore. So let your life unfold, and work yourself with your inner self that then is the attitude that you bring to bear on events. That's what's really important, and that's where your freedom lies, even in the relative, even in the temporal plane. Although, strictly speaking, there is no freedom whatsoever in the relative and temporal plane. But given the stages that you went through, and leaving aside for now then the issue of choice, the surrender through all those stages into what you are and offering that, yes, of course. It's like the story of, who's giving more, the guy who gives $5 and that's all he's got, or the millionaire who gives 10 million but actually he's got several billion. Who's giving more? It's like, okay, it's the guy with the $5 because he's giving everything. So I think if you're a little flower or something or other, and you're in total devotion, there is a wonderful thing, and it may turn out to be something far more than you imagined. Mm-hmm. We have to certainly develop into the, give birth to, and become what it is that we are. But the most important thing is, at the end of those stages you just described, that it's all offered. It's all offered up. It's not mine, it's not yours, and it's not something in relationship I give or offer. It's already part of the great torrent of consciousness.
Hmm. Nice place to leave it for today, Richard. When we come together the next time, we'll be talking about the last lecture in this series, of the Novena teachings, and the title of that lecture is Awareness, the Expression of Your True Nature.
It's been lovely to revisit the novenas.
It has. There's an energy with, I find, these 9 jewels of sacred teaching, as is the subtitle of Novena teachings, that really touches a place with me, and it's a real pleasure and honor to speak with you about them, Richard. So I look forward to the next time.
You too.
Thank
Until
you.
then. Bye for now.